Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 2. This week, we're stepping back nearly 500 years to a California that looked very different from the one we know today. The California you see in this hand-drawn map illustrates the Sierras that provided runoff into the Central Valley. It also shows the San Francisco Bay, where seawater flowed in the same Central Valley during the summer when the fresh waters evaporated. Over millions of years, this ebb and flow from the Sierras to the sea and back deposited tons of nutrients from plants, animals, and disintegrating rock into the soil. This is the reason that the Central Valley soil is the most fertile in the world. When this soil is combined with the unusually long growing season in California, it cannot be stopped. This has been proved by the fact that 1 person in 5 around the world eats something from California every single day. On September 28, 1542, Spanish explorer Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo sailed into what is now San Diego Bay, becoming the first documented European to reach the California coast. While this event is often described as the discovery of California, it's important to remember that California had already been home to thriving indigenous communities for thousands of years. Before Cabrillo's arrival, California was one of the most culturally and linguistically diverse regions in North America. Historians estimate that between 250,000 and 300,000 indigenous people lived here, representing more than 100 distinct tribes and speaking over 80 different languages. Although Cabrillo claimed California for Spain, the Spanish made no permanent settlements for more than 2 centuries. When they returned in 1769 to establish missions and settlements, they brought soldiers, missionaries, engineers, and educated people who carefully recorded what they encountered. Their journals provide us with some of the earliest detailed descriptions of California before it was transformed by European settlement. One of those men was Brother Juan Crespi, a Franciscan missionary who traveled with the Portola expedition. As he crossed California, Crespi struggled to describe what he saw. Rivers flowed freely across broad floodplains. Wetlands stretched for miles across the landscape. Massive oak woodlands covered the hillsides. Salmon filled the rivers, and indigenous communities had managed this environment for thousands of years. He was so impressed that he referred to California as this other Eden and the Garden Paradise. To an 18th century Franciscan missionary, California resembled the biblical Garden of Eden, a place of extraordinary abundance. This is a really important fact that you have to think about with California. If you read about the indigenous communities of that time, there was very little warfare in between tribes. And the reason for that, more than likely, is the fact that there was a phenomenal abundance of food. So if you have a lot of food, you don't need to fight for it. The other reason is there was a lot of geographical barriers. That means that maybe one tribe lived in one valley and it was surrounded by high mountains. The next tribe was in the next valley. So they didn't often meet each other and there was no reason for warfare. So this was a key factor in California's growth. Then the last thing I'm going to show you is that there's some comments from a book called The Early Days of California, which is a much more recent book. It's only about 200 years old. And you can see from this, it says, they find this highly diversified with lawns and groves of pine, fir, willows, poplars, a lot of undergrowth of roses and shrubs. The lands are dotted with clear, pure lakes. The country is inhabited with all sorts of wild beasts, bear, cattle, deer, rabbits, hare, wildcats, buzzards, geese, ducks, pigeons, partridges, thrushes, and so on. But then even in the ocean, okay, there's oysters, lobsters, crabs, sea wolves, porpoises and whales. So there's just an abundance. And the one thing I want to leave you with before we go on to the next slide is that um, when these Franciscan missionaries were writing in their journals, a couple of them commented that there were so many birds flying in the sky that you couldn't see the sky. It was dark, and there was so much food and such an abundance of natural fruits and vegetables that they literally thought they had died and gone to heaven. They could not imagine that there was this kind of an abundance anywhere. So it truly was paradise. Okay, today, much of that landscape has disappeared. Rivers have been dammed, wetlands drained, floodplains leveled, and millions of Californians now depend on one of the most complex engineered water systems in the world. This week, we're going to explore what California looked like before that transformation began. I want you to look at the Central Valley there in this picture. You see that whole green strip? That's the whole Central Valley. That was an inland sea. Remember I told you the water came from the Sierra Nevadas in the spring and summer and it flooded that whole Central Valley all the way up to Redding, all the way down past below Bakersfield. Then as that water evaporated, water came in from San Francisco Bay and flooded it with seawater. And then this went on for millions of years. That whole Central Valley isn't a wetlands anymore. We've greatly changed the landscape of California with actually by the advent of Europeans is really what it comes down to. You're going to discover what's called the Aboriginal waterscape, or sometimes it's called the virgin waterscape, a landscape shaped not only by nature, but also by thousands of years of indigenous stewardship. So we're going to look at pre-European California. Massive salmon runs returned to rivers each year, wetlands covered much of the Central Valley, and seasonal flooding created incredibly productive ecosystems. You're also going to learn about traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, the knowledge developed over countless generations through careful observation of the natural world. Indigenous Californians use practices such as cultural burning, seasonal harvesting, fisheries management, and habitat stewardship to maintain healthy forests, grasslands, rivers, and wetlands. As you complete this week's readings, I want you to think about one important question. What might California's water future look like if we combined modern science with the environmental knowledge that indigenous communities developed over thousands of years? I want to point out a couple things in this picture to you. Not only are they great old pictures, look at the size of the salmon in this picture. Okay, this was routine. It used to be that the salmon were so big and so plentiful, you could walk across huge rivers on the backs of salmon. When you go to Costco, when I go to Costco now and buy a salmon, at most, it's a foot and a half long. At most, 18 inches long. These bad boys, like they're almost as tall as grown men, and they weigh as much as grown men. So look at the difference in the salmon because we don't manage the salmon and the fisheries like we used to. Anyway, I hope you enjoy this week's exploration of California before European settlement. And, I'm around. If you need help, please do not hesitate to ask me.